Okay. We'll see if we have an answer by the end of today, but what's really interesting is there's a very expert audience in front of me, between postgraduate students, real translators, professionals, and other academics, so I'd be very interested to have your comments. When Diane invited me, I was not sure what to say, so I thought I might try and just condense bits of what I think are relevant, and of course once you start doing that you're not quite sure if in an hour or 3/4 of an hour you can give justice or not, so you will tell me. Feel free to, as we're a nice small group, ask, criticise maybe at the end, but if you feel the need to complain, then in terms of not being clear, then that's certainly something which would be very useful indeed, and we can start a conversation. Three areas maybe I want to focus on. One is the idea of narrativity, which is quite strong in translation studies now. Mona Baker in 2006 put out a book which was focused very much on the idea of narrativity, and her take was that narrativity is a dangerous thing, a little pernicious, and translators need to be aware of it. Ideological aspects, and she was very much obviously interested in conflict, and very particularly with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Gaze comes very much from the world of sociology, the tourist gaze. It's also a very well-known book, also in its 3rd edition, and that fits in very well actually with the idea of narrativity. And text function and reader, an idea I've taken from Grimas, and I'll try and make some sense of these points. We'll see. Okay, you're here because this is Scotland and you're interested in translating Scotland's heritage. And so what is heritage? This is something that you know, but it's probably a good idea just to get to some basics of what heritage is about. And clearly it's very much to do with the narrative. There's the past and it's relating it to the present. It's making it important. It's promoting. It's making an image of whatever is there. But more important than anything else, it's creating something that isn't necessarily obviously there. The buildings are there, but we're creating stories about them to make them of interest and to make them attractive. And that's really the area which I think is what makes tourism and tourism translation particular compared to other forms of translation. So it is the storytelling element which I think is a vital area in this area of tourism translation, which is important. Stories, clearly, we begin life with once upon a time, and we know where the story's going. And everything, more or less, that is communicated, in a certain sense, is a story. It's a fabrication, it's a representation. And the idea of narrative theory, and the various types of narrative theories, but they're all to do with the fact that there are connections, there are characters, there are personalities, things happen, there are sequences, they're linked, and importantly there's this connection. That's what makes a narrative, that's what makes a story. And that could be a science story, it could be writing up an experiment, it could be academic discourse. They're all stories, genres. They've got beginnings, they've got middles, they've got ends, we've got expectations. And we get carried along if they work. That's the sort of thing that I'm particularly interested in when it comes to tourism and translation. This is nothing new. This book, Interpreting Our Heritage, had its 50th anniversary a few years ago. It's very well quoted, you probably know of it. And in interpreting our heritage, the idea of storytelling is central to it. That when we present panels in museums or in parks, interpreting panels, they tell a story, and each one of the panels fits in, and the message is part of a larger story. And that the narration brings the experience alive. It's what creates the experience, which is really going back to the positive image and what it is that is heritage. So narrativity, what I'll look at are 4 particular strands of it, in theory, and then just a couple of translation examples for a couple of the strands. A lot of this comes from Mona Baker's understanding of other people who've talked about narrativity. And 2 basic levels. There's the personal narrativity, the way I see the world, the way I narrate it, and I live, work in a culture, so there's a cultural understanding of the way things are, the way reality is perceived and interpreted. The first aspect is this temporality. Once upon a time, we know that there's a beginning and there's going to be an end. There's a departure and there's an arrival. That's what makes a story work. Never-ending stories need endings. And so there is the idea of temporality. They're anchored in time in some way. Even if in a far, far away land, the beautiful princess, but it's a far, far away. We've located it somehow, somewhere. Then there's the idea of relationality, that the story's got bits that hang on together and they all make sense, they're part of the same train. And this is called relationality. So, like in a genre, you have various bits, the paragraphs fit in and provide the discourse. Going further into the carriages themselves, and this is where it gets very interesting, I think, the idea of causal implotment, that the carriages are different. So they're not just carriages in a train, but each carriage has its own meaning, it has its significance. You've got your first class, your air conditioned, your second class, and each one has its own meaning and its own weight. And this is where I think tourism translation, and just the presentation of heritage is important, that we make shades of difference within the general discourse. And the 4th one is the idea of selective appropriation. You can take different trains or different means of transport from the same place, and therefore you have a different journey. So you have the reality, and you can pick bits of it and take them on to different trajectories and arrive at different conclusions. Mona Baker sees this as being very dangerous, where news events, for example, are interpreted differently depending which side of the war you're on, or which side of the political divide you're on. You will appropriate bits of the reality, spinning. But I think in tourism discourse there are other more useful ways of looking at these, and we'll come back to, in particular, causal implotment and selective appropriation. Now, something I've actually worked on, and I'll give you just one, maybe 2 small, short examples. This is a museum in the town I live in southern Italy. It only opened 3 years ago in the centre of town, and it's the medieval Jewish Lecce Museum, in which there are, as you can see, panels, and not much else. It's an incredibly bare museum because there is very little left of the Jewish past in Italy. They were kicked out around about 1510, a long time ago, and there's very little left. So they're part of the heritage of the area, but there is very little to show. What there is are these extraordinarily dense, very wordy panels. They're too dense, they're too wordy. But I had the job of overseeing them, and one of the mistakes I made was allowing too many words in it, but various changes were made. The area that is of interest is this. You have the original texts, which were clearly written in Italian. So I'm giving you the opportunity to be outsiders looking in, to see what it's like on the receiving end. So here you are, you're going to a museum in which you've got texts that were originally written in Italian by a specialist, an academic. who's writing for a reader who lives in this area here, in Puglia, in southern Italy. And here are a group of local Puglians enjoying a celebration today, more or less. What's interesting is the fact that this museum is obviously designed for outsiders, popularising the specialist discourse of medieval Jewish history, Jewish practices, Jewish customs, things that quite clearly nobody is expected to know anything about. So that's the objective of this museum. So they're epistemic outsiders, but the language is Italian and the local population are insiders because of the language and because of the culture. So they're lingua cultural or lingua cultural insiders. And what's particularly interesting is the fact that nobody thought of translation when the text was first written. So the texts were written for a particular local public. They were being addressed, and we'll see an example of that. And what you've got when you talk about translation is a secondary communication situation which was not imagined. So you have the original text was written for an original audience, for an original set of reasons, and there is a form of discourse between writer and imagined reader. It was not ever written for translation, and the vast majority of texts are not written for translation. It's extremely rare to find a text that is already primed to go into different languages. This is a very rare case, and so tourism translation is a particular example of a recontextualization, when it's taken out of one context and put into another. But if we've got a medical translation and we are translating that, you're translating for the same professional group who are experts in this area. The cultural and the language side are much less important, whereas with tourism it's very different. So you've got a target text that is being prepared, which is clearly for a language-cultural outsider. But is it? The reader, in this particular case, we know nothing about the reader. This could be any of the readers, because the only non-Italian text is English. They do not need to be English. They're a world, it's a global audience. But what we do know is they're outsiders in all senses of the word. The idea of insider and outsider is quite simply the insiders have access, privileged access. And the original sense of insider and outsider was to do with social class. The insiders had access to money, to schooling, and as a result had much better possibilities of access to power, whereas an outsider remained an outsider. And this idea has been taken up in some areas of linguistics. Not that much, but it's particularly useful if we talk about tourism. So we've got our language-cultural outsiders, and we're providing a text. If we think in terms of this temporal and relational aspect of storytelling and narration, this is right in the centre of town, and it's a symbol of Lecce, and it's a very popular icon. What we have is the very beginning, where it's in Italian, and I'll translate this for you with a Google Translate, and we get, everyone knows about Baroque Lecce, but this is just the most recent part of a long history. Nothing wrong with the translation. La Lecce Barocca è nota a tutti, tutti is everyone. But of course the original text was being written for not everyone in the sense of the whole world, but everyone who lives locally. Because everyone who lives locally knows about this iconic structure and knows that it's Baroque, and it's known as a Baroque town. But our international audience doesn't necessarily know that. They're not part of this group. They're not part of everyone. Also, in terms of the temporality, unless you're an expert in architecture, you're not going to know where Baroque is in terms of anything else. You might understand that Baroque lecture is to do with architecture. You might make that link, but you might not. It is very, very implicit. So what you can do is work on that and think about your outsider and get involved with a stealth type of translation, where covertly you help the reader not feeling stupid, because if you read this and you think, oh dear, everyone knows about Baroque lecture apart from me. So what you can do is play with the text. But as soon as you do that, you have issues with the idea of what translation is. So, translation, all translations should be faithful. Interpretive translators do not alter. And most of the world's translation profession associations have a charter which is taken from the FIT, which is the International Federation of Translators. It's the biggest worldwide. And it is stuck in the 1960s with a charter that said this. But even that in ours, in Australia and New Zealand, November 2012, came out with their new charter, and interpreters and translators do not alter, add to, or omit anything from the content and intent. And translators do not make any changes according to the professional sector. And David Crystal, a well-known linguist, very open-minded and very keen on the concept of communication, in an interview that we had with him, said, I do not expect my translator to be a mind reader. I want my translator to translate what's there. I will then fill in what's implicit. Or you follow the other area, which is that you have mediation, or you have transcreation, or you have trans-editing, and you accept that the translator intervenes to fill the gap, and intervenes on the text and makes changes to the text. And at the moment we have this divide, where in the academic world there is a clear understanding that translation should be a creative act. You have the professional world, which is beginning to say, well, translators translate, copy editors can do other things, localizers can do other things, but translators translate in the translatere. And the origin of the term translation is the translating of saints. The bones of saints get taken from one church or from one tomb to another. They are sacred, the bones, and they do not get deformed, touched, and they arrive somewhere else exactly as they were. So you have this idea of the conduit or invariance, where the conduit is, in the digital world, the same idea, that you've got exact transmission. What comes in, goes along, and comes out in a different language. And so we go onto our Google Translate, and they do that for us. Brian Mossop, 2 years ago, came up with the invariance rule, which is that translators look for invariance. Translators look for similarity. And he's very against those who look for, or I would say accept, that there's difference. So you have this battle going on, and it's a stimulating, exciting one, up until when? Maybe the 1960s. There wasn't really quite such a clear interest in translation being a form of intervention. Ever since there was a cultural turn, sociological turn, other turns, there's been an acceptance that translation maybe should think about intervention. The problem is, once you decide that, you then have people saying, oh yes, but translators don't have the authority to intervene that much. We still want them to translate. We accept that there are problems, but maybe it's not the translator's job. And this is an open area where things are moving, but you'll find a lot of publications talking about the translator or the interpreter's dilemma, the zone of uncertainty. particularly in interpreting, and in particular with public service interpreting, where if you've got a human being here, you realise that they're not fully understanding, and you need to intervene because they need medical help, they need psychological help, they've got real problems that you are aware of, and the words translated are not enough. Anyway, what I came up with was this. Baroque literature is well known, not known by everybody, but the 17th century, so slipping it in without making anybody feel stupid, but giving the information and just a stealth, covert translation, putting it in. It's just the most recent part of a long history. What it does is it anchors in a place and a time and allows the reader to begin to recalibrate what sort of period of time, that far, far long ago time. And there are many other examples of that, but I want to move on to another area, if this will. The causal implotment. Again, we're at the beginning of this tour around the museum, the Jewish Museum. Here's the Italian, here's DeepL, which is better than Google Translate, and it does a very good job. Excellent translation. The visitor will enter the streets of the ancient medieval city, meeting the people who populated their daily activities, Apulians, Venetians, Albanians, Greeks, and especially Jews who lived in the neighbourhood. It's an excellent translation. As a translation, the question is, in terms of transmitting some form of involvement and some form of communication, is another matter. Because we've got the relationality, because we understand that we've got groups of peoples. That's not a problem. But we've got this distancing. The visitor will enter the streets of the ancient medieval city, where probably it is Lecce, but it's the. It's been distanced from me as the reader. I'm not really getting involved. Meeting the people who populated with their daily activities. Well, what activities? Okay, maybe it's early days, we don't need to know. And then we have these names, which means not very much to most of us here or anywhere else. But we see that there's this group, and then there are Jews, and we know this is a Jewish museum. But what was interesting was I talked to the writer, and this was a very interesting, unusual case of the translator being able to contact the original writer and ask about it. And what you get is that clearly the writer had in his mind what he was talking about. And the more he talked about it, the more it was clear who these people were. And what you got was a surface structure here, and a deep structure which was his representation. The story was there, but what was written here was the surface structure. The deep structure, he knew of these individual groups and how they fitted in, and there was some extra meaning which was completely hidden to somebody who doesn't know who these people were. We don't know who or anything about them, they're just part of a train. We don't have first-class carriages, second-class carriages. There is no causal implotment. And Mona Baker actually says that causal implotment is very nice. It gives weight and explains rather than just listing. There's significance. So, in the writer's mind, there is significance to these groups. He's the expert, he knows who they are. As a reader, they're just names. They could be any names. So what can you do? Again, stealth, little bits of addition to give some form of colour to the text. You are now about to start your journey. The reader is taken in and the story begins to unfold through the streets and alleys. Why streets and alleys? Well, if you think of streets, like outside, they're 21st century streets. The alleys, they were pedestrian. Takes you back a little bit. Of ancient medieval Lecce anchoring in. And on these streets you meet the people living at their time. Local Pulians were beginning to distinguish Venetian merchants, because they were coming from abroad and buying and selling them. We begin to give some form of colour to the character, which was, and this is what's interesting, in the writer's mind there was the colour. It was not transmitted to the text. The local readers would know a lot more about these people. And from across the sea, Albanians and Greeks, which then gives us this spatial representation that there was trade across. They become, if not alive, a little bit more substantial. So, that is, to a certain extent, what I've been working on in the idea of narrativity, in re-giving or re-narrating what was a narrative. Because if we simply translate, the narrative that's with its own temporality, its own relationality, and a lot of information is tacit, once you translate rather than trans-create, you automatically lose those anchorings. So my advice would be to reconsider translation and to consider re-anchoring and adding, reconnecting, so that the original narrative becomes a new narrative rather than translating across. This becomes interesting then if we look at tourism texts in terms of three areas of purpose. Lots of scholars have talked about text purpose, and usually there are three, sometimes six, and this is no different, but it's just been adapted a little bit for the tourism world, and in particular in terms of tourism guides. The terms come from Greimas. He talked about a grammar of action. And what I've simply done is taken the ideas and adapted them for tourism texts. And I think it helps show where tourism is a little bit special. So the first vouloir is to stimulate interest. Vouloir is I want to go there. So this is the promotional form of guide. And colourful, emotive, superlatives. What's interesting, of course, is that it works on the push factors. It works on the hot buttons. It works on the values. And promotion works when it touches our own interests. If it doesn't attract us, then the promotion's not going to work. And like in all areas of advertising, we need to be able to do the right, or rather, we need to be able to attract by hitting the hot buttons of the people we are writing for. Clearly, once you've got cultural factors, you're going to have differences as to what attracts what groups of people. The types of new publications, posters, coffee table books, but obviously lots of web advertising. The savoir purpose is clearly to do with knowledge, and of the more lexically dense texts, they're not going to be stimulating interest. You know you're going to work harder because you've presumably got more interest in following. And they're going to give you more of whatever the word culture is. They're going to give you the background, but clearly the background will build on wherever you are. And if you've got a cultural background that's very different, then you need to start building in a different area. Going back to the Jewish Museum, what was really interesting about it was the amount of understanding of the Catholic place you need to understand what's being talked about in the Jewish Museum. So the writer was very careful to explain everything Jewish, but didn't explain anything Catholic. And of course, it was the Catholic supremacy, and it was Catholic buildings, churches, that were built on top of the Jewish buildings that are talked about in the museum. But none of that's explained, because that background is understood. But in the savoir area, you need to think about that and start with a different background and add more information, because your audience are coming from a different background and will need a different form of knowledge. The last one I think is the most interesting, and the one that really distinguishes tourism translation from other forms of translation, because clearly all forms of translation have these differences to them. But the very interesting thing about tourism translation, particularly guides, is this third one, the pouvoir faire, which allows you to do something as a result. You pick up the guide and it tells you how to, where to, when to, and to a large extent gives you in a short space the information you need to act as if you were a local. So very much a DIY type tourist. And the Lonely Planet, Rough Guides, those sorts of guides, take the 21 bus, it's not very regular service, particularly on a Saturday and Sunday. It gives you that sort of detail. Go and see that at that time. So I'll give you a couple of examples of this and the way it doesn't work at times. When it doesn't work, this is Michael Agar's language, you get what he calls rich points, which is quite a nice term, where you're reading something and quite suddenly you realise that it's not quite working. Something isn't working at all. And in Gopin's language, it's that, what is it that's going on? And something's not quite going on as it should be. Mirella Gorni talks about the text writer not really identifying with the reader, and there's this lack of identification. And as you read, you as a reader, are not quite convinced that you fully understood, or something actually creates a problem, and there is a culture bump, or quite simply a misunderstanding. Which takes us to an area which is rather interesting. I think this is a very obvious and yet crucial part of anything to do with communication, where you've got the idea of boredom and stress in reading. If we're going to be promoting anything through the text, we need to make sure that our readers read the text and continue reading and do not get bored and do not close the book or move on from one panel to another because there's too much text or it's too complex. I'm not going to try and pronounce his name, Hungarian, but he talked about being in the flow, where you are quite simply just challenged enough to find interesting and not challenged too much to say that's it. Where you're in the flow, and so when we're studying, when we're writing, and the time flies and we've not noticed it, rather than the time dragging and we do notice it and we want to give up and it's heavy, it's hard work. So there's this constant between the demands on our brains and the difficulty of the text itself, or the complication of the text itself, and clearly along with the rewards. And getting that right is what makes a good writer than a writer who is not the page turner. So you've got these two things. One is the rich points, where you've got a problem in the text. The other is the need or the hope that you create flow. Because without flow, you're not telling the story, you're not getting to the end. I'll give you just an example of that. So going back to vouloir, which is to attract. Here we have a very interesting text here. It's from Sunday Times from a few years ago. And I show this to my students, and nobody has ever been able to tell me what is being advertised. What is the vouloir here? And none of my students have ever found what it is that's being advertised. Have you got any idea what's being advertised? This is the Sunday Times that's advertising a country. Are there any ideas? What country?
Italy. It's Italy.
It is. And none of my students have ever said Italy. Why? Very much because that tourist gaze. There is a way in which we see a country, and really interesting. I mean, I didn't know if that was going to be the answer, but there was something about this that told you Italy. What was it?
Well, no, I think I cheated though, because I've seen this before, so I know it is, but it just doesn't look like that. So I'm
Because you've seen these clump of trees before.
No, I've seen the picture, and doing the picture was like, this is Italy.
Exactly. This is a commonly seen picture, but not in Italy.
Yeah.
Nobody in Italy sees this picture. And they don't relate it to Italy, whereas this picture does look foreign. The trees are not local trees, whereas of course they're local in Italy, and they could not imagine that that would ever be a cover of a book or a supplement advertising the country. And they're shocked that anybody would want to photograph a clump of trees. But these trees are in the list of how many heritage places in Italy. I can't remember how many there are, but there are more in Italy than any other country in the world. And this is in Valdorcia, and these trees are part of they are a heritage site. And if you go there, you will find that the road over here is absolutely full of photographers. And they're all German, French, American, no Italians. They're not there. Because their gaze is a different gaze. Also, this is normal and routine, and there is nothing special about trees. In fact, my son went there, he came back saying, it's a clump of trees. Why would anybody want to take a photograph of them? But that's to do with the tourist gaze, and it's a case of selective appropriation, of looking at this rather than that. How this becomes important in tourism translation, well, some things are obvious, some things are less so. But what's really interesting is that native speaker written guides to Siena have cypress, the cypress trees, is the 20th most popular lexical item. In English written, or at least guides written in English to Siena. Guides written in Italian to Siena, translated into English, there are no cypresses. The closest we get are woods. So if you're talking about translating tourism, you've got a clear gap between what the Italians write about and what the non-Italians write about. And if you're going to be translating, you're not going to be filling in those gaps. You're going to be deducing something that's different, and quite clearly the level of attractiveness will be different. Because quite clearly we like cypresses. And, we don't like, so we like cypresses, and the translated guides don't have them. So you're losing something on a general level, because you've got a very different audience. This was thought of for one audience, it was translated, but isn't going to work in the same way as a native speaker written guide. I did the same job looking at Puglia, and looked at the Italian gaze to Puglia, and the tourists who come to Puglia, down in southern Italy, this is what they see. Mare, the sea, spiaggia, the beach, and then these towns. All of these towns are on the beach. So this is very much beach. They see the edges of the area I live in, and it does have wonderful beaches. I recommend them. And these are the Italian, so these were taken from blog pages and a variety of guides, newspaper supplements, and web guides, over the space of about 4 years. It was a fairly big corpus. The Brits and Americans who came to Italy also saw the sea, the beach, but the beach was the 15th. The 15th. The sea was the 19th. This town, Otranto, was 71st. They never got to this town. And Gallipoli was 84th compared to 20th. It was a completely different area that they saw. Their tourist gaze was very different. So what was number 1 or number 4 for the Brits and the Americans? The Trula. These are the Truli here. That was 4th. Olive, oil, olive tree, olive grove. Olive, olive, olive. And wine. And we'd probably go, of course. What was the Italian equivalent of this? The Trula was 64th. Look at these beautiful buildings. Again, full of Brits, full of Americans, full of Germans, no Italians. Olives? No, there are no olives in Puglia. There's no olive oil. There are no olive trees. There are no trees. And there are no olive groves. Wine? 65th. Why? Because there's better wine up north. They've all got wine. They've all got olive trees. But when others, and it's what's interesting is that the tourist gaze, although they're Brits, they're Americans, and they're various other nationalities writing in English, tend to have a very similar outsider tourist gaze. They are different, but there are certain things that bring them together as being outsiders. So that's the vouloir, and the vouloir really you can't translate. You need to go and have a cultural informer, or you need to know the culture itself to recreate a vouloir guide. What about pouvoir? So the pouvoir is the ability to act as if, the ability to get into much more of a local scene rather than just know about it. This is a guide to coffee drinking in Trieste. And there's a mixture of things in it. There's vouloir savoir and also this pouvoir faire. And here's the English translation. Okay, how to drink, it's just called coffee in Trieste. And this is the translation. As you can read, it's not a native speaker translation. In a Triestine cafe, you can hear orders like this. Give me a long decaffeinated cappuccino and cold glass without little foam. So you can hear, it's clearly not a native speaker, which in itself isn't the problem. And it goes on. In terms of vouloir, it's not a very attractive beginning with the imperative, give me a long decaffeinated coffee. The intention was to make a joke that Triestini make complicated coffee orders, not just un café, but they ask for very, very long particular. But it doesn't work at all. It doesn't work in terms of vouloir at all. In terms of savoir, it doesn't tell us very much. It tells us the cappuccino is not the same as it is everywhere else. There are subtle variations, such as the gocciato. But what is the gocciato? What is the difference? It's not the same, and it just leaves us with this bridge point of not fully understanding. But what I'm particularly interested in is the pouvoir faire, because this is actually a guide on how to drink coffee in Trieste, not just a savoir. And the pouvoir tells us this. Yes, coffee is still coffee, but if you wish to enter into the local spirit, then it's best to ask for our N-E-R-O. Now, in English, if we ask for an N-E-R-O, we probably say a Nero. And we might have learned Italian, per favore, because we've learned some Italian. But if you ask for a Nero, this is who you get. Robert De Niro, because the Italian is Nero, which may sound similar, but it's the same as asking for a ship instead of asking for a sheep. You don't necessarily realize that the two sounds are very similar. And if you're in an Italian bar, you're going to be very confused if somebody asks for a Nero. So the pouvoir doesn't really work at all. And if you look at native speaker guides to drinking coffee, they work very differently. And they work with a series of instructions of how to do it. First you go to the bar, you need to go and pay first. You need to jostle, like you do in an English bar, and so on and so forth. And you get all the information, including you must drink your coffee quickly, because the Italians drink coffee in 3 sips. And you get this information, but it's the native speaker, outsiders, who tell you how to do it. Your translator, who is translating, can very rarely do a good job because it's designed for a different public. So, as we're in Scotland, I thought maybe we'd have a quick look at the Scottish branch and just have a very, very quick look at translating Scotland, destinations. Very quickly, just the sorts of things that I saw when looking at this. So this was about Rob Roy. Now, I don't know who Rob Roy was as a tourist, but I've been told that he's obviously an important icon, and clearly there's a lot of information about him. Immortalised in written word on the silver screen is to many a Scottish Robin Hood. Okay. And then there's this fascinating ridge point here, which genuinely for me was a ridge point, because I saw a gravestone, which I recognised, but I did not recognise MacGregor, and I couldn't understand MacGregor despite them. What I can understand, this is a ridge point, is that this clearly has great meaning, great significance, because it's not explained. But it's absolutely meaningless to an outsider. Even more meaningless is visit the Highland Cateran's grave at the Kirk in Ba. You're getting the idea of the way the outsider who has no Scottish culture begins to just have rich points and is not attractive. So we look at Walk the Rob Roy Way, following the famous drover's footsteps. Drover? Oops, let me go to Drover and just go Drover. I went on to engrams. Do you know what engrams are? Very interesting. Engrams gives you the words over the last 200 years, the popularity of words in lots of books. Google's archive, as you can imagine, is huge. So it's everything that's on the web and everything that's been digitalised. And as you can see, Drover has had its ups and downs, but it's definitely got its downs. And if you compare Drover with shepherd and farmer's not doing very well either. Whereas computer, you get this sort of idea that there's language which may be extremely important for Rob Roy, but if you're an outsider linguistically, you may be mother tongue English, but you're American English. And if you're a teenager English from somewhere outside Scotland, I asked a few over the last few weeks, none of them knew what Drover was. None. Most of them heard and they went, yes, I think that's English, but that's about as far as they've got. So you've got this problem in terms of, okay, linguistic outsiderness, even if you're a mother tongue. But I need to go back because I've missed out something here. Whoops. Yes, okay. And then look at what's interesting here. So this is about Rob Roy. So this is what we first read. Rob Roy, immortalised in written word and on the silver screen. I like this. Rob Roy is to many a Scottish Robin Hood. Now you know instantly who this is being written for. Who is the public? English. Exactly. Not the world. Because Robin Hood was from Nottingham, not from Saudi Arabia or from any other place. It's a very English. And this is really interesting that whoever wrote it was thinking about who the tourists are. And you can translate this quite happily into Arabic. And here you have the Arabic Robin Hood. So you can do that and translate into whatever language you like. But as a vouloir, it would be clearly much better to come up with Rob Roy's Domeni, a Song Jiang, or Huarong. Do we have any Chinese here? Do you know these people? Okay. Does that make sense? Okay, but that's the point. So you're no longer translating, but you're anchoring into other people's reality, and automatically the storytelling becomes a little bit more live, and you are being drawn into the narrative. So the unfamiliar is made familiar, but you're then encouraged to move on into the unfamiliar through something that you can get into. So your gaze is being directed from what you know. Or any Japanese? Ah, does this make sense? I mean, because I need a cultural informer. Does it help? Okay, so not that popular. I mean, what you need to do is find a cultural informer who maybe find a more popular figure that would work. Robin Hood is clear for you? You prefer Robin Hood? Okay. But that's the general idea, that when you're thinking in the vouloir, you need to think of who is my audience and what's going to work better, rather than translating what's in the original text. This is the general point. Sometimes you can use Robin Hood, but it depends on the language and it depends on that group of people. So, we looked at Rob Roy already, and I think we've just got one more example to give. And I'll be open for questions. Oh no. This was just interesting. This was a spoof type, I think, guide for the Japanese. Warns over Scots football and apparently sausages, a certain type of sausage. But what was this? This was interesting. Until now, the emphasis of Scottish tourism was on visiting historical sites, playing golf. The younger people are showing a keen interest in how to buy drinks at a local pub. And probably, many people are saying, how to buy drinks at a local pub, but that's normal. That's not really what we're into. And certainly, I'm not recommending that we change heritage tourism into drinking tourism at all. But the point being that this is much more interesting in a pouvoir fair. That part of tourism is about the ability of doing something that the locals do. And that there are many routine activities, such as buying coffee in Italy, or ordering drinks at a local pub. But what's interesting is instructions on buying around. It's doing what the locals do. It's getting into a local way. We as locals probably don't see it because it's what you do. But the tourist gaze is often exactly on what is absolutely uninteresting. That clump of trees is not interesting to the locals, but it's extraordinarily interesting for others. So what you need to do when you're translating tourism is move out of your own reality, and you need to be bicultural, or you need to have that group of cultural informers that can allow you to recreate a text that works in whatever language it is. And this would be the same for an international English. So, the last point is this. An interesting negative vouloir effect, where, I'll just show you. What do you think is a problem here? Could be. Tranquil interlude. Anything else? It could be a problem in translation. Could be. What you have, this was research that was done years ago, but it's extremely relevant. Tonino Manca wrote an article called Welcoming Children. And what they looked at was the collocation of children, welcome, and what they discovered was the collocation of children, dogs, children. And they then looked at the equivalent Italian, agriturismo, in Italy, and looked at benvenuto or any other welcome words, and children, and dogs, and pets. And what they found was that there is no children and welcome, and of course there's absolutely no children and dogs. Why is there no children plus welcome? Exactly. It's exactly that. It's taken for granted. So how do they react when they read well-behaved children and dogs? Well, they really, and this was the article that focused on this, see this as an extraordinarily inhuman society that there is, and they are not attracted to places that welcome children, because if you have to mention it, it quite seriously means that this is not a great hotel in this case to go and visit. At which point I've come to the end of this and open to questions.